Have you ever noticed that some mornings feel different? You open your eyes, the light filters in, and for a brief moment the world seems new. What if every morning was like that? What if, instead of dragging yesterday's worries into today, we could see each sunrise as a sacred invitation, an opportunity to begin again? Buddhism teaches us that life is not just a long, unbroken line of days. Each morning is a rebirth. It is not a continuation of yesterday's story, but a new page waiting for us to write on it. And when you reach the later years of life, mornings begin to carry a deeper meaning. You wake up, you breathe, and that simple act is proof that life has given you another chance, another day to live with awareness, another day to bring peace to your heart, another day to walk gently on this earth. Old age is often spoken about with fear, as though it were only decline. But what if it is actually an invitation to see life more clearly, to strip away everything unnecessary and rediscover what truly matters? The Buddha never saw aging as a punishment. Instead, he saw it as a teacher, a guide that helps us let go of illusions and rest more deeply in peace. So this morning, as you sit here listening, allow yourself to slow down. Imagine that the hours ahead are not ordinary but precious, like jewels placed in your hands. Feel your breath, notice the quiet around you, and understand that nothing about this moment is guaranteed. That's what makes it sacred. This is not just another morning routine. It is a reflection, a journey, a meditation on what it means to wake up, not only from sleep, but from forgetfulness. Because so many people drift through life as if each day were owed to them. But when we truly awaken, we realize each morning is a gift that many will not receive today. And in that realization, gratitude and clarity begin to rise naturally in the heart. In the coming moments, we will walk together through timeless Buddhist lessons, 7 reflections for the morning, each one offering a way to find peace in the face of impermanence, joy in the midst of aging, and compassion that grows wider with every breath. Think of it not as learning something new, but as remembering something you've always known deep within yourself. So, let us begin. Take a gentle breath. Feel the rise and fall of life itself moving through you. This morning is not yesterday. It is not tomorrow. It is here, right now. And it is yours to live fully. There's a quiet miracle that happens every single morning, yet most of us barely notice it. We open our eyes. We take our first conscious breath of the day. Our heart is still beating, our lungs are still working, and life has given us another chance. This is the gift of waking up. Think about it. How many times have you gone to bed at night without any guarantees that you'd see the morning light again? None of us truly knows if we'll wake up the next day. And yet, when our eyes open, when the sun filters through the curtains or the first sounds of the world stir us awake, life is whispering, "Here you are, one more day, one more opportunity." Too often, instead of gratitude, our first thoughts are complaints. I didn't sleep enough. I don't want to go to work. I wish I had more time. We roll over, grab our phones, scroll through endless messages or news, and instantly flood our minds with noise. We forget the simple wonder that we even have a morning at all. But what if we paused, just for a moment? What if, upon waking, we placed our hand over our chest, felt our heartbeat, and simply acknowledged, "I'm alive. I've been given another day." That tiny shift transforms the entire tone of our morning. Gratitude turns ordinary moments into sacred ones. The Buddha often reminded his disciples that each morning is a precious chance, not to be wasted in worry, anger, or distraction, but to be lived fully, mindfully, and kindly. He taught that awareness of impermanence doesn't have to make us fearful. It makes us appreciative. The fact that nothing is guaranteed means everything is meaningful. Imagine waking up tomorrow and treating that moment as if it were your very first day on earth. No baggage from yesterday, no projections into the future, just the freshness of this morning. The air feels different. The light looks brighter. Even the act of standing, stretching, or pouring water feels like a gift. Life doesn't need to be spectacular to be miraculous. Simply waking up is already a blessing denied to many. If we can carry this realization with us, not in a heavy, serious way, but in a gentle, joyful way, then every morning becomes an invitation to live more deeply. So, as you rise tomorrow, remember, it's not just another day, it's another chance. Another chance to love, to learn, to forgive, to create, to simply be. And that, more than anything, is worth waking up for. When the first rays of sunlight touch the earth, something subtle happens. The world stirs awake. Birds begin their songs, the breeze feels lighter, and the darkness of night slowly gives way to the colors of morning. This is not just nature's routine, it's a reminder of renewal. And in this quiet renewal, gratitude finds its home. Gratitude in the morning is more than saying, "I'm thankful." It's a way of aligning your heart with life itself. It's the decision to see what is present rather than what is missing, to notice rather than to overlook, to appreciate rather than to demand. As you step into the morning light, look around you. The roof above your head, the bed you slept in, the air filling your lungs, even the silence before the world gets busy, these are treasures. Yet because they arrive every day, we treat them as if they are owed to us. But nothing in life is owed. Everything is a gift. The Buddha once said that a mind filled with gratitude is a mind already on the path to liberation. Why? Because gratitude frees us from craving. It loosens the grip of "I need more" and softens the constant hunger for what we don't have. When you wake with gratitude, the day feels full before it even begins. Picture starting your morning not with stress or complaint, but with a simple pause to acknowledge life's blessings. Whisper to yourself, "Thank you for this body that carries me. Thank you for this breath that sustains me. Thank you for this day I've been given." These words are not small, they are powerful. They reshape your entire state of being. Gratitude doesn't mean life is perfect. It doesn't mean ignoring struggles or pretending pain doesn't exist. It means choosing to notice what is good, even in the midst of what is difficult. Just as dawn breaks even after the darkest night, gratitude reminds us that light always returns. And when we cultivate gratitude each morning, we carry that light with us throughout the day. Conversations become gentler. Work feels less like a burden. Even challenges shrink in size when viewed through the lens of appreciation. Gratitude is not just a practice, it's a way of seeing. So tomorrow, when the morning light touches your skin, pause for just a breath. Let that light awaken not only your body but your heart. Let it whisper a reminder that life is precious, that today is enough, and that gratitude is the key to seeing the sacred in the ordinary. Every morning, the sunlight that greets us is never the same as yesterday's. The air, the sounds, even the way our body feels, everything has changed, even if only slightly. This is the quiet reminder that life offers us each day. Nothing stays the same. Impermanence is not a threat. It is the most honest teacher we have. Like a mirror, it reflects back the truth of existence, that all things rise, change, and fade. The morning itself is proof. The cool freshness soon warms, shadows shift, and before long the day is already moving toward its end. Yet most of us resist this truth. We cling to what we love, fearing its loss. We push away what we dislike, hoping it will disappear. But impermanence reminds us that both joy and sorrow are passing guests. Neither will stay forever. The Buddha taught that the root of our suffering lies in forgetting this truth. We suffer not because things change, but because we expect them not to. We want permanence in a world that is built on movement. But what if, instead of fighting impermanence, we embraced it? Imagine looking into this mirror each morning and seeing its wisdom clearly. The face you see today is not the same as yesterday's. The worries you carried last week may have already softened. The pain you thought would last forever might already be fading. Change is not only loss, it is also possibility. Think of a flower blooming in the morning sun. Its beauty is breathtaking precisely because it will not last. Its fragility makes it precious. Our lives are no different. When we see through the lens of impermanence, we stop taking moments for granted. We hold them gently with gratitude, knowing they are fleeting. This realization doesn't make life sad, it makes it luminous. Because we know nothing is permanent, we love more deeply, forgive more quickly, and live more fully. We stop postponing joy, because tomorrow is never promised. So, as you stand in the morning light, let impermanence be your mirror. See yourself not as fixed or trapped, but as ever-changing, ever-growing. Each breath is a reminder, this moment will never come again. And that is exactly what makes it beautiful. In the stillness of the morning, when the world has not yet demanded too much from us, there lies a quiet strength waiting to be awakened. That strength is mindfulness. Not loud, not forceful, but steady, gentle, and unshakable. Mindfulness is often misunderstood. People imagine it as something complicated, reserved for monks sitting in meditation halls or seekers on distant mountain tops. But mindfulness is not about escaping life. It's about arriving fully into it. It is the simple, powerful act of being here now. Consider your first sip of water in the morning. If you are lost in thought, it's just another action in a long list of routines. But if you are mindful, you notice the coolness on your tongue, the way it refreshes your body, the gratitude of knowing this water sustains your life. One act, drinking water, transforms from ordinary into sacred. The Buddha called mindfulness the path to freedom because it breaks the cycle of distraction. When we are mindful, we are no longer prisoners of our wandering thoughts, regrets of yesterday, or anxieties of tomorrow. We return home to the present moment where life actually happens. And here is where its quiet strength reveals itself. Mindfulness doesn't remove life's challenges, but it changes our relationship to them. Anger may still arise, but mindfulness prevents it from taking control. Fear may still knock at the door, but mindfulness gives us the space to respond with clarity rather than panic. It's like standing in the middle of a storm with an anchor deep in the earth. The winds may howl, the rain may pour, but you remain steady. Mindfulness is that anchor. It doesn't silence the storm, but it keeps you from being swept away. Practicing mindfulness in the morning sets the tone for the entire day. When you begin with presence, you carry presence. Your words become more thoughtful, your actions more compassionate, your heart more open. Life no longer feels like something rushing past you. It feels like something you are fully alive within. So tomorrow, as you wake, don't just rush into your tasks. Pause, feel your breath. Notice the light entering your room. Listen to the quiet. Even one mindful moment in the morning can ripple through your entire day. Because mindfulness is not about changing who you are. It's about remembering who you already are. Awake, alive, and capable of meeting life with clarity and strength. As the morning unfolds, mindfulness naturally opens the door to something even deeper: compassion. When we are present, when we truly see ourselves and the world without distraction, the heart begins to soften. And in that softening, compassion arises. Compassion is often spoken of as something we give to others, caring for their pain, offering kindness, lending a hand. But true compassion begins closer to home. It begins with ourselves. Think for a moment, how often are you hard on yourself? How often do you wake up with self-criticism, replaying past mistakes, or burdening yourself with expectations? We treat our own hearts with a harshness we would never direct toward a friend. Yet the Buddha reminded us, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Compassion for oneself is not indulgence. It is healing. It is acknowledging our struggles without judgment, our flaws without shame, our humanity without rejection. When we hold ourselves gently, we begin to loosen the tight grip of inner suffering. And when we can show kindness to ourselves, compassion naturally flows outward. We start to notice the silent struggles of others, the tired eyes of a coworker, the heavy sigh of a stranger, the quiet pain behind someone's smile. Compassion turns our gaze outward, not with pity, but with connection. It whispers, just as I long to be free from pain, so do you. Just as I wish for happiness, so do you. Imagine beginning your day with this mindset. Instead of rushing into the world armored with defensiveness, you move with a tender strength. You treat yourself kindly and you extend that same kindness to others. Even small gestures, a gentle word, a patient pause, a smile, become acts of compassion that ripple far beyond what you can see. Compassion doesn't mean you must solve every problem or carry every burden. It simply means you choose to meet life with an open heart rather than a closed one. And in doing so, you discover that compassion nourishes not only those around you, but your own spirit as well. So tomorrow morning, as you wake into mindfulness, place your hand on your heart. Breathe deeply. Whisper to yourself, "May I be at ease. May I be kind to myself." And then, carry that same wish outward. May others too find ease. May others too be met with kindness. This is how compassion begins, not as a grand gesture, but as a gentle practice, one morning at a time. Morning is not only a time for new beginnings, it is also a chance to release what no longer serves us. Among the heaviest burdens we carry are regrets. They cling to us like shadows, whispering of what we should have done, what we should have said, or how differently life could have turned out. Regret is natural. Every human heart has felt its sting. But if we are not careful, regret becomes a chain that binds us to the past, stealing the joy of the present moment. We wake up each day, yet part of us still sleeps in yesterday. The Buddha taught that clinging to the past is like grasping a burning coal. It only brings pain, yet still we hold on. Why? Because regret convinces us that replaying the past will somehow change it. But the past is already gone, untouchable, unchangeable. All we hold is the echo, not the event. Letting go of regret does not mean denying responsibility. It means recognizing that the only place we can create change is here now. If there is something to learn, we learn. If there is someone to forgive, we forgive. If there is a wound to heal, we take the step today, not tomorrow, not in the memory of yesterday. Think of a tree in autumn. When the leaves are ready, it does not cling to them. It lets them fall, so new life can emerge in spring. We too must allow old regrets to fall away, so that fresh growth can appear in our hearts. And here is the beauty. When we let go of regret, what remains is wisdom. The past no longer weighs us down, but instead becomes a teacher, reminding us of what truly matters. The sharpness of regret transforms into the softness of understanding. So as the morning light enters your window, ask yourself, what regrets am I ready to release today? Not all at once, perhaps, but one by one, like leaves drifting gently to the ground. With each release, you make space for peace, for joy, for compassion, for the life that is unfolding right here in this very breath. Every sunrise is a reminder that life continues. But hidden within that reminder is another truth. One day the sun will rise and we will not be here to see it. This is not meant to frighten us. It is meant to awaken us. The final journey, death, is not a punishment nor an accident. It is part of the natural flow, the great cycle of impermanence that we have been learning from each morning. Just as night follows day, so too does death follow life. And just as the dawn always returns, perhaps something within us also continues, in ways we cannot fully understand. Preparing the heart for this journey begins now, not later. It begins by living so fully, so mindfully, that when the time comes, there is no regret, no unfinished business, only peace. To prepare is not to escape life. It is to embrace it more deeply, knowing that every moment is precious because it is impermanent. The Buddha often taught that awareness of death is the key to living with wisdom. When we remember that our time is limited, we stop wasting it on anger, on clinging, on trivial concerns. Instead, we turn toward what truly matters: love, kindness, compassion, and understanding. Think of the morning as a small rehearsal for this final journey. Each time we sleep, we let go of the day. Each time we wake, we are reborn into a new chance. And one day, when we lay down for the last time, the practice of letting go will already be familiar. To prepare the heart, we do not need grand rituals. We need gentleness. We need forgiveness for ourselves and for others. We need gratitude for the life we have lived. And we need trust that just as the sun sets and rises again, there is a rhythm, a mystery beyond what the mind can see. When the heart is prepared, death is no longer an enemy. It is a doorway. And when that moment comes, it will not feel like a thief in the night, but like a quiet friend who has walked beside us all along. So, As you rise each morning, let this awareness guide you, not into fear but into freedom. Live in such a way that when the final morning arrives, your heart is ready. Ready not with resistance but with peace. Ready not with clinging but with release. Ready to step into the great unknown with the same courage you greet each dawn. Every morning is more than just a new beginning. It is practice. A rehearsal for how we wish to live, how we wish to love, and how we wish to eventually let go. The small rituals we embrace at dawn shape not only our day but the quality of our entire life. Think of the morning as a mirror. If we begin it with rushing, worry, and distraction, that energy often carries through the hours ahead. But if we begin it with mindfulness, gratitude, and compassion, then even the most ordinary day becomes a field for awakening. The beauty of practice is that it doesn't demand perfection. It asks only for presence. Every breath in the morning can be a meditation. Every sip of tea, every step across the floor, every glance at the rising light. These are moments where we can anchor ourselves in awareness. Slowly, gently, the morning becomes a teacher, showing us how to live with intention rather than habit. And here's the truth. Living each morning as practice means we don't wait for special occasions to be fully alive. We don't wait for the retreat, the holiday, or the perfect conditions. We practice here now in the simple fabric of daily life. The morning breeze, the sound of birds, the stillness before the world awakens. These are our temples, our classrooms, our invitations. The Buddha often reminded his disciples that enlightenment is not somewhere far away. It is cultivated in each step, each breath, each act of kindness. And the morning, fresh and uncluttered, is the perfect ground for planting these seeds. When you treat the morning as practice, even difficulties become opportunities. A restless mind becomes a chance to return to the breath. A feeling of heaviness becomes a reminder of impermanence. A surge of gratitude becomes fuel for compassion. Nothing is wasted because everything can be part of the path. So tomorrow, don't just wake up, practice waking up. Don't just see the sunlight, practice seeing it as if for the first time. Don't just move through your routines, practice honoring them as sacred. Let each morning be your training ground so that when the bigger moments of life come, love, loss, change, even death, you are already prepared, steady, and free. Living each morning as practice is how we transform life from something that simply passes by into something we actively shape with awareness and care. One sunrise at a time. And so here we are standing at the threshold of another morning. We have walked together through gratitude, mindfulness, compassion, impermanence, and forgiveness. Each reflection has been like a stepping stone across the quiet river of dawn, guiding us toward a deeper peace. But now the question is simple. How will you step into this day? You do not need to rush. You do not need to carry every burden you've been holding. You can walk gently, softly, as though each step is both a gift and a prayer. Because it is. Imagine yourself as the morning sun, rising not with force, not with hurry, but with patience. The light touches everything equally, the beautiful and the broken, the joyful and the sorrowful. Can your heart do the same? Can it meet this day with that quiet generosity? To walk gently into the day is to live without fear of losing time. It is to recognize that every hour has its own rhythm, every encounter its own meaning, every breath its own value. When you walk gently, you leave room for wonder. You leave room for kindness. You leave room for peace. And perhaps most importantly, walking gently is how we prepare for all of life's journeys, the small ones and the final one. Because when we learn to enter each morning with stillness and love, we will also know how to enter the unknown with courage and grace. So before you rise, before you speak, before you plan or remember or worry, pause, breathe, feel the soft truth of this moment, the gift of being alive, the chance to live fully, the freedom to let go. Then step forward, not into another routine, not into another blur of hours, but into a sacred day. May you walk lightly, may your heart remain open, and may your wisdom shine quietly like the morning sun blessing the earth. This is the way of Zen. This is the wisdom of Buddhism. This is the invitation of each new dawn. to walk gently into the day, and in doing so, to discover peace that has been within you all along. If these reflections have touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us on this path of mindfulness and wisdom. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom and join a community of seekers walking gently together. May each morning bring you peace, clarity, and compassion. Until we meet again, breathe deeply, smile softly, and carry this calm into your day.